Dr. Elena Rodriguez pressed her face against the cold metal window of the colony ship Thunder Bay. Behind them, Earth looked like a tiny marble floating in the darkness of space. She couldn't believe this was really happening. After 43 years of life on that blue planet, she was now being forced to leave forever. The ship was massive, bigger than any building Elena had ever seen. It stretched for miles in every direction, housing 50,000 people who just yesterday had been living normal lives on Earth. Now they were all refugees, cast out into the cold emptiness of space by the very planet that gave them birth. Elena walked through the main corridor, listening to the sounds of families crying, children asking where they were going, and old people wondering if they would ever see home again. The smell of recycled air mixed with the fear and sweat of thousands of displaced humans. This wasn't how anyone had imagined their future would look. 3 months ago, everything had been different. Elena was working as a scientist, helping design ways to grow crops on other planets. She lived in a small apartment in Mexico City with her cat, Pedro, and spent her weekends hiking in the mountains. Life was simple and good. But then the Global Environmental Council made their announcement that changed everything. The message played on every screen, every radio, and every communication device on Earth at exactly the same time. A stern-faced woman in a green uniform spoke directly to the camera. "Citizens of Earth," she said, after careful study and consideration, "the Council has determined that human beings pose too great a threat to our planet's delicate ecosystem. For the good of all life on Earth, humanity must be relocated to other worlds." Elena remembered laughing when she first heard it. It sounded like a joke, like something from a bad science fiction movie. But within hours, massive ships began appearing in the sky above every major city. They weren't there to invade. They were there to take everyone away. The evacuation happened faster than anyone thought possible. Families had just 6 hours to pack whatever they could carry. Pets had to be left behind because there wasn't enough room on the ships. Elena still remembered Pedro's confused meowing as she walked out the door for the last time. Now, 3 months later, Elena found herself in charge of the Thunder Bay's agricultural department. Someone had to figure out how to feed 50,000 people during a journey that might last decades. The ship's leaders had chosen her because of her expertise in growing food in harsh conditions. What they didn't know was that Elena had never actually worked anywhere except comfortable laboratories on Earth. The ship's captain was a former military officer named David Park. He was a serious man who rarely smiled, but Elena could see the weight of responsibility crushing down on his shoulders. During their daily meetings, she watched him struggle with impossible decisions. How much food should they ration? Which families should get the larger living spaces? What would they do if the ship's systems failed? "We're not just trying to survive. This journey," Captain Park told Elena during one of their late-night planning sessions, "we're trying to make sure humanity has a future somewhere out there among the stars." Elena looked at the star chart spread across the table between them. Each tiny dot represented a possible new home, but they were all so far away. The nearest potentially habitable planet was over 60 years of travel time. Most of the people on this ship would grow old and die before they ever saw solid ground again, but something interesting was happening among the passengers. Instead of giving up hope, people were starting to adapt in ways Elena had never expected. The ship's engineers were working with the scientists to improve the life support systems. Teachers were developing new ways to educate children who would spend their entire childhood in space. Artists were creating beautiful murals on the metal walls to make the ship feel more like home. Elena spent her days in the agricultural bays, working with teams of volunteers to maximize food production. They were growing vegetables in ways that had never been tried on Earth, using every available inch of space and recycling every drop of water. The work was hard, but it brought people together. She found herself making friends with former accountants, construction workers, and musicians who were all learning to become farmers. One day, while Elena was checking on the tomato crops, a young engineer named Alex Chun approached her with an exciting discovery. Alex had been experimenting with the ship's computer systems and found that they could modify the artificial gravity generators to create better growing conditions for their plants. "Look at this," Alex said, showing Elena a section where the gravity was slightly lighter than normal. The plants there were growing faster and producing more food than anywhere else on the ship. "If we can fine-tune this across all our growing areas, we could increase our food production by 30%. Elena was amazed. This kind of innovation would have taken years of research and testing back on Earth. But here, with limited resources and desperate need, people were making breakthrough discoveries in just months. As the weeks passed, Elena began to notice other changes happening throughout the ship. The children who had left Earth as scared, confused kids were becoming something different. They moved through the ship's corridors with confidence, navigating the three-dimensional maze of passages like they had been born in space. They played games that involved floating and spinning in ways that would have made Earth-born adults sick. The teenagers were even more remarkable. They seemed to instinctively understand the ship's complex systems and were often the first to spot problems or suggest improvements. When the recycling system in Section C broke down, it was a 17-year-old named Jamie who figured out a creative solution. Using spare parts from the entertainment center, Elena realized that these young people were becoming the first generation of true space dwellers. They didn't miss the feeling of wind in their hair or the warmth of sunlight on their skin because they had never really known those things. For them, home was wherever their family and community happened to be, whether that was on a planet or floating in a metal container between the stars. The adults were changing too, though more slowly. Elena watched former office workers become expert technicians, as she saw quiet accountants transform into inspiring community leaders. The challenges of space travel were bringing out abilities in people that they never knew they had, but perhaps the most significant change was in how people thought about their future. Back on Earth, most humans lived their entire lives in the same general area where they were born. They thought in terms of cities and countries and continents. Now, floating in the vastness of space, people began to think bigger during community meetings. Elena listened to conversations about terraforming entire planets, building cities that floated in space, and creating transportation networks that could connect distant star systems. These weren't just dreams anymore. They were plans being developed by people who now had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Captain Park often spoke about the importance of maintaining hope during the long journey ahead. But Elena could see that something more powerful than hope was growing among the passengers of the Thunder Bay. It was determination mixed with innovation and strengthened by the shared experience of starting completely over. One evening, while Elena was working late in her laboratory, she received a message from her sister Maria, who was on a different colony ship heading toward a star system on the opposite side of the galaxy. The message had taken 3 weeks to reach her, but it was full of similar stories of adaptation and discovery. "Elena," the message said, "I wish you could see what's happening here. People are becoming something more than what we were on Earth. We're not just surviving this exile. We're using it to become stronger, smarter, and more capable than we ever imagined possible." Elena smiled as she recorded her reply. She looked out the window at the stars surrounding their ship and felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Earth. It wasn't homesickness or sadness. It was excitement about what lay ahead. The Global Environmental Council had intended to save their planet by removing humanity from it. But Elena was beginning to suspect that they had accidentally done something much more significant. They had freed humanity from the limitations of thinking like a single-planet species. As she prepared her response to Maria, Elena chose her words carefully. "We were banished from one world," she said into the recorder, "but now we have the opportunity to claim them all." 63 years had passed since the Thunder Bay left Earth's orbit. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was now 96 years old, her hair completely white and her hands shaky from age. But her mind remained sharp, and what she saw happening around her filled her with wonder and pride. The ship had transformed into something completely different from the desperate refugee vessel that had fled Earth decades ago. Walking through the corridors now felt like exploring a floating city. The walls that once displayed emergency instructions and evacuation routes were now covered with artwork created by 3 generations of spaceborne artists. Gardens bloomed in every available corner, their leaves reaching toward artificial suns that never set. Elena's granddaughter, Luna Rodriguez Kim, had been born in the deepest part of space 47 years into their journey. Luna had never felt grass beneath her feet or breathed air that wasn't carefully filtered and recycled. Yet she moved through the ship's 3-dimensional maze with a grace that Elena could never match, even in her younger days. "Grandma Elena," Luna said, floating effortlessly beside the old woman as they made their way to the weekly community. "Assembly, tell me again about the trees on Earth?" Elena smiled, remembering her own grandmother's stories about horses and carriages in old Mexico. Now she was the keeper of memories about a world that seemed almost mythical to the younger generations. "Trees were like the support pillars in our ship," she explained, "but they were alive. They moved in the wind and changed colors with the seasons." Luna nodded politely, but Elena could see that the concept was difficult for her to truly understand. For Luna and her generation, life was metal and circuits and carefully controlled environments. They had adapted to this reality so completely that Earth's chaotic natural systems seemed almost impossible. Captain David Park had died 12 years earlier, passing leadership to his son Miguel Park. Miguel had spent his teenage years learning every system on the ship and had grown into a natural leader. Unlike his father, who had been trained for military command on Earth, Miguel had developed his leadership skills in the unique environment of space travel. The ship now ran with an efficiency that would have amazed the original passengers. Every person on board had multiple skills and responsibilities. The old Earth distinctions between blue-collar and white-collar work had completely disappeared. Luna, for example, was both a quantum physicist and an expert at growing protein-rich algae in the ship's biological systems. Elena often visited the education centers where children learned subjects that hadn't existed when she was young. They studied 3-dimensional mathematics that helped them navigate in zero gravity. They learned to communicate across vast distances using quantum entanglement techniques. Most importantly, they learned to think of space not as empty void to be feared, but as home to be mastered. The teenagers were particularly fascinating to watch. They had developed their own culture that was unlike anything from Earth. They played sports in zero gravity that looked like elegant dances. They created music using the harmonic vibrations of the ship's hull. They even had their own language that included hand signals and body movements that worked perfectly in the silent vacuum of space. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in how people thought about problems. On Earth, humans had often focused on adapting themselves to their environment. In space, the survivors had learned to adapt their environment to themselves. They weren't just passengers on a ship anymore. They were engineers of their own reality. Elena remembered the day, 20 years ago, when the ship's main computer system had started failing. On Earth, this would have been a disaster requiring months of repair by specialized technicians. But the spaceborne generation had approached the problem differently. Instead of trying to fix the old system, they had designed and built a completely new one in just 6 weeks. The new computer wasn't just better than the original. It was unlike anything that had ever existed on Earth. It could think and learn, and grow more powerful over time. It helped manage every aspect of life on the ship, from air recycling to food production to entertainment. Most amazingly, it could communicate with similar computers on other colony ships across the galaxy through these connections. Elena had learned that similar transformations were happening on all the exile ships. The Thunder Bay was part of a network of mobile civilizations that shared knowledge and resources across impossible distances. Humans who had once been limited to communicating across continents were now coordinating activities across light years. The ship's workshops had evolved far beyond their original purpose of basic maintenance. They now produced technologies that Earth scientists had only dreamed about. Miguel Park showed Elena through a facility where teams of engineers were building devices that could manipulate matter at the atomic level. They called them reality shapers, and they could turn raw asteroids into useful materials or even create complex machinery from basic elements. "We're not just surviving anymore, Elena," Miguel explained as they watched a team of young people construct a new life support module using nothing but space dust and energy from their fusion reactors. "We're learning to create whatever we need. Wherever we are, food production had become an art form. The agricultural bays that Elena had once managed with such difficulty now produced more nutrition per square foot than the richest farmlands on Earth. The spaceborne farmers had learned to grow everything from fruit trees to protein-rich insects in carefully controlled environments. They had even developed new types of food that could only exist in zero gravity, but the most significant development was happening in the ship's research laboratories. Teams of scientists who had been born and raised in space were making discoveries that challenged everything humans thought they knew about physics, biology, and engineering. They weren't limited by Earth-based thinking about how things should work. Dr. Anna Volkov, Elena's former assistant who was now the ship's chief scientist, had developed a way to generate energy by manipulating the space between atoms. This technology provided the Thunder Bay with virtually unlimited power. Other teams had learned to grow materials that were stronger than anything found in nature and to create communication systems that could send messages faster than light. Elena often wondered what Earth's Environmental Council would think if they could see what humanity had become. The dangerous species they had banished had not been weakened by exile. Instead, they had grown stronger, smarter, and more capable than ever before. The children born in the deepest part of space were different from their grandparents in ways that went beyond culture and technology. They thought faster, learned more quickly, and could solve problems that would have challenged teams of Earth's best scientists. They weren't just adapted to space travel. They were evolved for it. During one community meeting, Elena listened as Luna and her friends discussed their plans for when they reached their destination. They weren't just hoping to find a planet where they could survive. They were planning to build a civilization that would be better than anything that had ever existed. "We'll terraform the whole solar system," Luna said with the confidence of someone who had grown up believing that any problem could be solved with enough creativity and determination. Not just one planet, but multiple worlds, each designed for different purposes. "We'll have research worlds, agricultural worlds, manufacturing worlds, and worlds just for beauty and art." Elena smiled, remembering when such ideas would have seemed impossible. But she had watched these young people accomplish impossible things their entire lives. They had grown up in an environment where impossible simply meant not yet figured out. The ship's communication systems brought regular reports from other exile vessels. Each ship had developed its own specialties and strengths. Some had become expert at terraforming technology. Others had mastered advanced manufacturing or biological enhancement. Together, the scattered fleet represented a collection of human knowledge and capability that far exceeded what Earth had ever achieved. As Elena prepared for sleep in her small quarters, she looked out at the stars and felt something she had never expected during those dark early days of exile. She felt grateful. The Environmental Council had intended to save Earth by removing humanity from it. Instead, they had freed humanity to become something magnificent. The refugees had become pioneers. The exiles had become explorers. And the dangerous species that Earth had rejected was preparing to return home as the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever seen. Luna Rodriguez stood on the observation deck of the Thunder Bay, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at something no human had seen in over 70 years. A planet, a real solid world spinning slowly against the backdrop of stars. After decades of traveling through empty space, they had finally found their new home. The planet was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that reminded Luna of her grandmother's stories about Earth. Swirling clouds covered most of the surface, and she could see vast oceans and continents that stretched beyond the horizon. The science teams had named it Kepler 442b, but everyone was already calling it New Terra. "It's bigger than Earth," said Captain Miguel Park, joining Luna at the window. "More water, thicker atmosphere, and the gravity is only slightly heavier. Our children will grow up stronger here." Luna nodded, but her mind was already racing with possibilities. She wasn't just thinking about survival anymore. The spaceborne generation had learned to think bigger than that. They were planning to make this world better than Earth had ever been. The landing process took 3 months of careful preparation. Unlike the desperate evacuation from Earth, everything about their arrival was planned and organized. The ship's engineers had spent years designing landing protocols that would protect both the planet's ecosystem and the human colonists. Luna led the first survey team to reach the surface. As her boots touched solid ground for the first time in her life, she felt a strange sensation. The dirt beneath her feet felt unstable compared to the reliable metal floors she had known since birth. The wind that blew across the landing site carried smells and sounds that were completely foreign to someone raised in recycled air, but rather than feeling uncomfortable, Luna found the experience thrilling. This chaotic, unpredictable environment was exactly what humanity needed to grow beyond the limitations of ship life. Here, they could build something completely new. The first settlement was established in just 6 weeks. Using the advanced construction technologies developed during their long journey, the colonists created a city that looked nothing like the crowded, polluted cities their grandparents had fled on Earth. The buildings were designed to work with the planet's natural systems rather than fighting against them. Dr. Anna Volkov, now the colony's chief scientist, had perfected atmospheric processors that could transform the planet's air composition in just months rather than centuries. But she made sure the changes enhanced the existing ecosystem rather than destroying it. The colonists had learned from Earth's mistakes. "We're not here to conquer this world," Anna explained to Luna as they watched the processors begin their work. "We're here to become part of it, to make it better while making ourselves better too." Within the first year, New Terra had transformed into something extraordinary. The colonists used their matter manipulation technology to create materials that didn't exist in nature. They built structures that could grow and adapt like living things. They developed transportation systems that moved people and goods without creating pollution or noise, but perhaps the most impressive achievement was the orbital shipyard that Luna's team constructed above the planet. Using resources from the asteroid belt, they built a facility that could produce spaceships larger and more advanced than anything that had ever existed. These weren't just transport vessels like the Thunder Bay, they were mobile cities, research stations, and manufacturing centers all combined into single ships. Luna often stood in the shipyard's control center, watching teams of workers who had been born in space collaborate with engineers who were adapting to planetary life. Together, they were creating technologies that neither Earth nor the exile ships could have developed alone. The new ships they built could travel between star systems in weeks rather than decades. They could establish colonies on planets that would have been impossible to terraform with Earth technology. Most importantly, they could communicate with each other instantly across any distance, creating a network of human civilization that spanned the galaxy. News from other exile ships was equally impressive. Each group of colonists had found different solutions to the challenges of building new worlds. Some had learned to create floating cities on water worlds. Others had built underground civilizations on planets with harsh surface conditions. Few had even established space stations and systems, with no habitable planets at all. But all of these scattered communities shared certain characteristics. They were more technologically advanced than Earth had ever been. Their people were healthier, smarter, and more capable than the humans who had been left behind. And they all maintained detailed records of their journey from exile to triumph. Luna's favorite project was the Genetic Adaptation Program. Working with volunteers from the colony, her research team had developed ways to help humans thrive in different planetary environments. Some colonists had enhanced lung capacity for worlds with thin atmospheres. Others had improved radiation resistance for planets with weak magnetic fields. These weren't dramatic changes that made people look different. They were subtle improvements that made life better and safer. The most remarkable volunteers were the children who had been born on New Terra. They seemed to naturally adapt to their environment in ways that amazed even the scientists. They could see better in the planet's unusual light conditions. They could sense changes in weather patterns days before the meteorological equipment detected them. They moved through the forests and oceans like they had lived there for generations. "They're becoming something new," Ina told Luna during one of their research meetings. Not just humans adapted to space, not just humans adapted to this planet, but humans adapted to any environment they encounter. As the colony grew and prospered, Luna began receiving reports from Earth that painted a very different picture. The Environmental Council's perfect balance had led to a world that was stable but stagnant. Earth's human population had dropped to less than 1 billion people, and their technology had barely advanced since the exile ships departed. The reports described a planet where every aspect of human life was carefully controlled to prevent environmental damage. People could only have children with government permission. New technologies had to be approved by committees that took years to make decisions. Creativity and innovation were discouraged because they might disrupt the delicate balance the council worked so hard to maintain. Luna shared these reports with the colony's leadership council, a group that included representatives from every major family and profession in their new society. The contrast between Earth's decline and their own rapid advancement was obvious to everyone. They wanted to save their planet by getting rid of U.S., said Captain Miguel Park during one heated discussion. But they've turned Earth into a museum where nothing ever changes and nothing new is ever created. Dr. Aina Volkov had a different perspective. Maybe that's what they wanted, she said thoughtfully. A quiet, peaceful world where nothing unexpected ever happens, but that's not what humans are meant for. We're meant to grow, to explore, to become more than we were yesterday. Luna found herself thinking more and more about Earth as the months passed. Not because she wanted to return to a world she had never seen, but because she realized that humanity's story wasn't complete. There were still people on their birth planet who deserved the chance to become everything they could be. The turning point came when New Terra's communication systems received a desperate message from a group of Earth scientists. They had secretly been monitoring the progress of the exile colonies and were amazed by what humanity had accomplished in space. But more importantly, they had discovered that Earth's ecosystem was beginning to fail despite the Council's careful management. Without human innovation and adaptation, the message explained, our planet's environment is becoming too stable. Species are going extinct because they can't evolve fast enough to handle natural changes. We need the knowledge and technology you've developed to save not just humanity, but all life on Earth. Luna read the message several times, feeling the weight of history settling on her shoulders. The exiled humans had become more than survivors. They had become the guardians of human potential itself. And now their birth planet was calling them home, not as returning refugees, but as saviors. Standing in her laboratory overlooking the thriving city of New Terra, Luna made a decision that would change the course of human history. It was time to return to Earth, not to conquer, but to share what they had learned. The dangerous species that had been banished for being too ambitious was ready to show their home world what true ambition could accomplish. 70 years had passed since the first colony ships landed on New Terra. Commander Luna Rodriguez Kim, now in her final years, stood in the observation tower of Terra Prime, a massive space station that orbited 3 different stars simultaneously. What she saw through the transparent walls would have been impossible to imagine when she was young. Hundreds of worlds sparkled like jewels across the galaxy, each one home to millions of humans who had never known the limitations their ancestors faced on Earth. Ships the size of cities moved between star systems, carrying people, resources, and ideas at speeds that made the old Thunder Bay look like a child's toy. The scattered refugees had become the rulers of space itself. Luna's great-grandson, Commander David Chunvolkov approached her with the daily reports from across their vast empire. His name reflected the mixing of bloodlines that had occurred over generations of space travel. His genes carried the best traits from dozens of different human populations, and his mind had been enhanced with technologies that allowed him to process information faster than any Earth-born human could imagine. "Grandmother Luna," David said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had grown up believing that any problem could be solved. "The Council of Worlds has approved the final preparations for Operation Homecoming." Luna smiled at the irony. The homecoming they were planning wasn't a return of lost children seeking forgiveness. It was the arrival of gods preparing to reclaim a shrine they had long outgrown. But she kept these thoughts to herself. The younger generations didn't think in terms of revenge or conquest. They simply saw problems that needed solving and applied their vast capabilities to fix them. Terra Prime itself was a testament to how far humanity had advanced. The space station was larger than most countries had been on Earth, home to over 1 trillion people who lived in comfort that would have seemed magical to their ancestors. The station's inhabitants could travel to any of its countless districts in minutes using transportation systems that folded space itself, but size wasn't what made Terra Prime remarkable. It was the fact that it existed in 3 different star systems at once, using technology that allowed it to occupy multiple locations simultaneously. People could have breakfast while orbiting one star and lunch while circling another, all without ever leaving their home. The technologies that made this possible had been developed over decades of innovation by humans, who weren't limited by Earth-based thinking about what was possible. They had learned to manipulate time, space, matter, and energy in ways that turned science fiction into everyday reality. Luna walked through the research districts, where scientists worked on projects that would have seemed like magic to her. Grandmother Elena, in one laboratory, researchers were creating new forms of life designed to thrive on planets with extreme conditions. In another, engineers were building machines that could construct entire solar systems from raw space dust, but perhaps the most impressive facility was the communication center, where operators maintained instant contact with human colonies across the galaxy. The network connected over 3,000 worlds, allowing for coordination of activities on a scale that no single-planet civilization could achieve. The reports that came through these communication channels painted a picture of human expansion that was both breathtaking and slightly overwhelming. Every month brought news of new colonies established, new technologies developed, and new challenges overcome. Humanity had become a force of nature that transformed everything it touched. On the agricultural worlds, farmers had learned to grow crops that could feed billions of people while actually improving the planet's ecosystems. The food they produced was more nutritious than anything that had ever existed on Earth, and the farming methods they used made their worlds more beautiful and diverse over time. The manufacturing worlds had developed production systems that could create anything from complex starships to simple household items without generating any waste. Everything was recycled, reused, or transformed into something else. The concept of throwing things away had become as outdated as traveling by horse and buggy. The research worlds were perhaps the most fascinating. Scientists there worked on projects that pushed the boundaries of knowledge itself. They had learned to create artificial intelligences that were smarter than human minds but remained loyal and helpful. They had developed medical technologies that could repair any injury and prevent any disease. Some researchers were even working on ways to extend human life indefinitely, but it wasn't just technology that had advanced. Human society itself had evolved in remarkable ways. The rigid hierarchies and competing nations that had caused so much conflict on Earth had been replaced by flexible networks of cooperation. People identified themselves not by the accident of where they were born, but by what they chose to contribute to human civilization. Luna often received reports from Earth that showed how different their paths had become. The Environmental Council still controlled every aspect of life on the home planet. People lived in small, carefully managed communities where change was discouraged and innovation was seen as dangerous. The population had stabilized at just under 1 billion people, and their technology had barely advanced since the exile ships departed. Earth's leaders claimed to have created the perfect society, free from the chaos and destruction that humanity had caused in the past. They pointed to their clean air, stable climate, and peaceful communities as proof that their approach was correct. But Luna could see the cost of this perfection in the reports her agents sent back. Earth's humans had become smaller in every way that mattered. They lived shorter lives, had fewer children, and dreamed smaller dreams than their space-born cousins. Their art was careful and conservative. Their science was focused on maintaining existing systems rather than discovering new possibilities. They had achieved stability by giving up the very qualities that made humanity great. The contrast became even more obvious when Luna read intelligence reports about Earth's reaction to news of the human space empire. The Environmental Council had tried to suppress information about their exiled cousin's success, but word had spread anyway. Some Earth-born humans were secretly building communication devices to contact the colony worlds. Others were attempting to leave Earth to join the space-born humans, but the Council's response had been predictably rigid. They had declared contact with the exile colonies to be illegal and had begun imprisoning anyone caught trying to communicate with their spaceborne relatives. They insisted that Earth's way of life was morally superior and that the technological advances of the space colonies represented a dangerous return to humanity's destructive past. Commander, David approached Luna with the latest intelligence report. From Earth, his expression was troubled, which was unusual for someone whose generation rarely encountered problems they couldn't solve. Grandmother, he said, our agents report that Earth's ecosystem is beginning to collapse despite the Council's careful management. Species are going extinct at an accelerating rate, and the climate is becoming unstable. But the Council is refusing to admit there's a problem, and they're rejecting offers of help from our scientific teams. Luna wasn't surprised. The Environmental Council had built their entire identity around the belief that they had created the perfect system. Admitting that they needed help from the dangerous humans they had exiled would mean acknowledging that their fundamental assumptions were wrong, but Luna could see the bigger picture. Earth wasn't just struggling because of environmental problems. It was dying because it had cut itself off from the driving force of human evolution, the willingness to take risks, make mistakes, and constantly strive to become something better. The spaceborne humans had maintained this drive and had used it to become something magnificent. They had learned to create rather than just consume, to build rather than just maintain, to dream of possibilities rather than just fear dangers. They had become what humanity was always meant to be. As Luna prepared for what might be her final council meeting, she realized that Operation Homecoming wasn't just about rescuing Earth from environmental collapse. It was about reuniting humanity with the part of itself that it had tried to reject. The exiled children were coming home, not as conquerors, but as teachers ready to show their family what they could become. The dangerous species that Earth had feared was returning, but they brought gifts that would transform their birth world in ways the Environmental Council could never imagine. Commander David Chenvolkov stood on the bridge of the flagship Stellar Phoenix, watching Earth grow larger through the viewscreen. It had been 163 years since his ancestors had been forced to leave this small blue planet. Now he was returning, but not as the same species that had been exiled. Humanity had evolved into something far beyond what Earth had ever imagined possible. The fleet that accompanied him was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. 10,000 ships, each one larger than the biggest cities that had ever existed on Earth, but these weren't just transport vessels. They were mobile worlds, carrying entire civilizations within their hulls. Scientists, artists, engineers, and philosophers from across the galaxy had volunteered to be part of this historic return. David's neural implants connected him directly to the collective consciousness of over 1 trillion spaceborne humans. Through This link, he could feel the excitement and anticipation of his people as they approached their ancestral home. But he could also sense something else, sadness for what Earth had become during their absence. The planet looked smaller than the records had suggested. After decades of living on worlds they had terraformed to be perfect, after building space stations that dwarfed continents, Earth seemed almost quaint. The cities were tiny compared to the massive urban centers that flourished on the colony worlds. The lights were dim compared to the brilliant glow of the spaceborne civilizations, but what struck David most was how quiet Earth seemed. His ship's sensors detected almost no space traffic, no orbital construction, no signs of the bustling activity that characterized every human world in the galactic empire. Earth had become a museum of what humanity used to be, preserved in amber. By a government that feared change more than death itself, Dr. Ana Park Rivera, David's chief advisor and a descendant of the original Thunder Bay crew, joined him at the command station. Her appearance would have shocked Earthborn humans. Her skin had a subtle luminescence that helped her body process different types of radiation. Her eyes could see across a broader spectrum of light. Her mind could process information at speeds that would overwhelm someone from Earth, yet she was still fundamentally human, just evolved for life among the stars. The Environmental Council is requesting a meeting, Ana reported. They want to negotiate what they call peaceful coexistence terms. David almost smiled at the irony. The Council still thought they were in a position to negotiate. They didn't understand that this wasn't an invasion or a conquest. It was a family reunion between cousins who had grown in very different directions. The meeting took place on a neutral space station that David's people constructed in Earth's orbit within 6 hours. The speed of its creation alone demonstrated the vast gap between spaceborne and Earthborn capabilities. What would have taken Earth's engineers months to plan and years to build, the galactic humans had completed before lunch. The Earth delegation arrived in shuttles that looked primitive, compared to the sleek vessels used by the spaceborne humans. The Environmental Council members wore simple green uniforms and carried themselves with the rigid posture of people who had spent their lives following strict rules. Their leader, Administrator Patricia Williams, was a stern woman in her 60s, who looked at David's people with barely concealed fear. "We welcome you back to Earth space," Administrator Williams began, her voice carefully controlled, "but we must establish clear boundaries. Earth has achieved perfect environmental balance, and we cannot allow that to be disrupted by outside influences." David studied the Earth delegation with enhanced senses that could detect their stress hormones, heart rates, and neural activity. These people were terrified, not just of his technological superiority, but of the very concept of change itself. They had built their entire society around the idea that stability was more important than growth. "Administrator Williams," David replied gently, "we haven't come here to disrupt anything. We've come to help. Our sensors show that Earth's ecosystem is failing despite your best efforts. Species are going extinct, climate patterns are becoming unstable, and your human population is declining. We have solutions for all these problems." The administrator's face flushed with anger. "Our systems are working perfectly. We have maintained environmental stability for over a century. We don't need help from people who abandoned their responsibilities to their home planet." Dr. Ana stepped forward, her enhanced mind quickly analyzing the psychological patterns of the Earth delegation. "We didn't abandon anything," she said calmly. "We were forced to leave. But that exile allowed us to grow beyond the limitations that are now destroying your world. We've learned to work with natural systems instead of trying to control them. We can share that knowledge with you." The negotiations continued for hours, but it became clear that the Environmental Council was more interested in maintaining their authority than in solving Earth's problems. They had built their identity around being the saviors of their planet, and admitting they needed help would undermine everything they believed about themselves. Finally, David made a decision that would change human history forever. "Administrator Williams," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who commanded star systems, "we're not asking for your permission anymore. We're going to save Earth whether you cooperate or not." The transformation began immediately. David's fleet deployed millions of microscopic devices that began repairing Earth's damaged ecosystem at the molecular level. These weren't the crude, disruptive technologies that humans had used centuries ago. They were sophisticated systems that worked with natural processes to enhance and strengthen them. Within days, the changes were visible from space. Polluted rivers began running clear. Dead forests started growing again. Extinct species were brought back to life using genetic templates preserved in the galactic archives. The air became cleaner and fresher than it had been in centuries, but the most dramatic changes were in the human population. The spaceborne humans began sharing their medical technologies freely with anyone who wanted them. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia were cured overnight. Genetic defects were repaired. Aging was slowed and in some cases reversed. The Earthborn humans who accepted these gifts found themselves becoming stronger, smarter, and more capable than they had ever imagined possible. Children born after the spaceborne humans arrived were different from their parents in fundamental ways. They could learn faster, think more clearly, and dream bigger dreams. Dr. Aina established research centers around the globe where Earthborn and spaceborne humans worked together on projects that would have been impossible for either group alone. They developed new forms of agriculture that could feed billions while making the planet more beautiful. They created technologies that provided unlimited clean energy without any environmental impact, but perhaps the most important change was in how people thought about their future. The rigid, fearful mindset that had dominated Earth for over a century began to give way to the bold, optimistic vision that characterized the spaceborne humans. People started taking risks again, trying new things, pushing boundaries. The Environmental Council tried to resist these changes, but their authority crumbled as ordinary Earthborn humans saw what was possible when they were free to grow and evolve. Within months, the Council's rigid control system had been replaced by the flexible, adaptive networks that governed the Galactic Empire. Administrator Williams, one of the last holdouts, finally approached David 6 months after the return. She looked older and more tired than before, but there was something different in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or wonder at what her world had become. "I was wrong," she admitted quietly. "We thought we were protecting Earth by limiting human potential, but we were slowly killing both our planet and our species. You've shown us what we could have been all along." David placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You weren't wrong to care about Earth," he said. "You were just thinking too small. We've learned that the best way to protect any world is to make sure the people living on it never stop growing, never stop dreaming, never stop becoming more than they were yesterday." As David stood in the same spot where his ancestor Dr. Elena Rodriguez had once worked, he reflected on the journey that had brought humanity to this moment. The Environmental Council had tried to save their planet by exiling its most ambitious species. Instead, they had given that species the freedom to become something magnificent. The dangerous humans had returned home, but they brought gifts that transformed their birth world into something better than it had ever been. Earth was no longer humanity's only home. It was the heart of an empire that spanned the galaxy, proof that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone go so they can become everything they were meant to be.